At least it's not 10 degrees. It's actually not 10 degrees. 64 degrees in New York.
Out there.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah. You know what the thing is, though? I'm never, ever happy in New York because there's just a million people outside. So when I was walking here, it's just like you can't move. So it's either cold or there's too many people. There's just I can never be happy.
In the middle of summer actually is my favorite time in New York because there's a lot of people who leave the city.
Yeah.
It's crazy how much it dies down. Students, I think people are just like traveling. It's crazy though, especially in my neighborhood and along the West Side Highway. It feels like it's a private little part of town and it's just gorgeous outside.
That's amazing.
The birds are chirping, the trees are blooming. It really feels like a movie studio. It's awesome. But yeah, it was nice this weekend. It's getting cold this weekend. Upcoming weekend, it's going to rain. And I'm going to be in Miami. So I have this nice 64-degree weather to just,
to prep you for.
Yeah. Wean me into a weekend in South Beach. So I'm excited.
Yeah. If you go from like 10 degrees to 72, no good.
Too much. Get sick.
Too much too soon.
Yeah. So I was just editing the last week's podcast, actually, and we were talking about all that dependency stuff. Is pretty interesting. But we left off talking about Mirage and AddonDocs. And one of the projects I've been working on is getting the blog set up there. So pretty cool little setup that we have. As I said last week, I used to use Discuss, and that's like involves a lot of setup, and you have to register an account, and people have to log into Discuss with like Twitter or whatever. And it's just kind of a bummer. So
you don't like the UI either. That's like one of the main drivers.
That is one of the main drivers. Yeah, it's not. It would be sweet if there was like a headless version. But there's ads, and it makes sense. They're a business, but AddonDocs is about finding like free open source solutions that like even someone who's just making kind of a rinky-dink add-on on a weekend can feel like they have a really polished thing, And I've actually thought about this kind of coming back to like one of our missions in kind of all the work we do. One of the things that drives us is like figuring out ways to enable and empower small teams or individuals to produce the kind of work that you would see from like a world-class company like an Apple or something like that. So I feel like the nice website with version docs and search and even a blog with comments is part of that package. So the idea that me just hacking on a weekend and I basically get this stuff for free is pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's great. That's great because if it has Discuss, it stands out like a sore thumb.
Exactly.
Yep.
So it doesn't feel like you own it. So one solution I kind of searched. The blog part, we had a pretty good solution for. Like in Mirage, I poured over the blog post from our Jekyll site to the AddonDocs site. And since we already had in AddonDocs a way to take a markdown file and at build time, run a broccoli transform on and turn it into a handlebars template, that was pretty much good to go. So Markdown's great. It's like portable. It's pretty awesome that I have blog posts in a Markdown format in a Jekyll app from 4 years ago, some old Ruby static site generator. And I can just put them as data into my Ember app.
Yeah. I mean, Markdown's been around for what, like 8 years? I don't know. I have
think
no
more
idea.
than that.
More than that. But I feel like it's used so much in the development community. It's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, totally.
Where like
and it's certainly more portable than basically anything else you author in.
Yep.
At this point. So it's really cool. Anyways, so we already had that working. And so that was relatively straightforward. But then like wanting to have comments just as a way, you could argue like maybe you don't need comments, but there was something nice about it. It was a way to get quick feedback. When I used to blog more on Mirage's site. And in general, like I see Chris Pizurak like blog about his decorators project. He's put a ton of work into that. He has a personal blog. He's written some blog posts on like, I think Adapar's Medium blog, or he might have also a Medium blog, but you could imagine Ember Decorators having a blog site where some of the content that's in the guides right now is like a blog post, which is like, here's where we're at in, February of 2019.
Yep.
So I think it would just be cool if that was as easy as creating an issue. So the first step was like, we were using the handlebars, the markdown files, the handlebars broccoli compiler. And then it was like, how can we get comments in here? So I Googled like how to use GitHub comments, GitHub Issues as comments, or something along those lines. I made my way there. And there was this really cool blog post from, Artsy Engineering?
I think so, yeah.
And they do this. So they have this set up. and they basically use GitHub Issues as comments in their blog posts. And it's really cool because it's headless. Like GitHub has an API, so you just query it. You have all the data you need, and then you just render those issues as comments. And if you want to comment, you click a link, and you're actually just brought to a GitHub issue thread, and you see all the comments right there, and you get to reply, and it shows up on the website. So it's kind of almost like best of both worlds, where GitHub already gives you this place for dynamic data. It gives you a great authoring tool, like everyone who is a developer. The nice thing is that this happens to be like developer websites. AddonDocs sites are for developers. So developers already are familiar with GitHub, have GitHub accounts.
Yes.
And then you can just click there and author a comment.
Yeah. And AddonDocs projects already have a GitHub account.
Right.
So it's not only that the developers have accounts, but the repo is also
Yes,
on GitHub.
Exactly. So you have like a scoped project already. So that was pretty interesting. Then we talked about being able to author comments from the website. And there you get into a little more tricky territory, because now you're not on github.com.
Yeah. The website that you're authoring on needs to use your GitHub account to post on GitHub.
On your behalf.
Yeah.
Basically.
And I think you make a GitHub app to do that.
Right. So there was this thing called Utterances, which you can check out. We'll have a link in the show notes. It's really cool. And they basically try to streamline this as much as possible. And they make it so if you want to comment on your blog, a user can click a button. They're brought to GitHub, and they say Utterances needs access to your like account. And you click add or enable or allow. And then when they go back to their site, they see like a blank issue format, and then you can just do it right there, which is pretty cool. This particular project, Utterances, also like styled all the comment thread as like GitHub Issues as close as possible. So that's another area where it's like you would want this to be headless ideally.
I was going to ask. So they ship CSS.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
And you could probably overwrite that, because under the hood they are just doing API calls, and like that has all the data you need, but they don't have any easy way to do that.
Yeah, you've already tasted provider components. You don't want to go back to bang important CSS rules.
Exactly. But then the second part of that is like, even if you had a renderless version of that and you could match your style of your site, it's maybe a little weird that your users have to allow Utterances access to their account or to give them an account or whatever. It's just kind of weird.
Yeah, it's friction.
Friction.
The first time they see that, like, what is this? What is it going to have access to?
Now, if this was like a widely used thing, that would be one thing, right? If it was called like a GitHub comment service.
Is this?
And it was basically the way Discuss is, because the way Discuss is at this point in the game, people know what Discuss is, and they're okay signing in with like their Twitter or something like that.
With something like Utterances, if you authorize it once, then you can comment on any website that
uses Utterances.
This.
Yes.
Okay.
So I was like clicking around some of the other example apps, and I was like already able to comment with my avatar and everything.
That's cool. So maybe there is like a network effect thing here, where like once more people start using it, more people will be logged in, and then it will grow even faster.
Right. The problem is that this is just like a one-off project, and it's new, but it's like young, and so I wouldn't want to like bet the farm on it. You know what I mean?
There was something else, right? Like when the Mirage website, when it's making API calls, the browser is making API calls to GitHub.
Yeah. So yeah, there's more layers here. So starting from the outside or whatever, like this is like the UI decisions, right? Which is like there's a trade-off. Like on the one hand, put the users through some friction, but then they can comment from the website, or just send them to GitHub, and then it's like that's kind of weird because, well, they're in GitHub and there's no friction. You're already logged in, and that's great, right? But now you're outside of the context of the post. So, okay, there's a few issues here. So yeah, let's talk about what you just said first, which is, let's say you go that route. You have the comments in a thread, and you now say, okay, there's like a top thread. The first comment in the thread is just like a pointer back to that markdown rendered file on your AddonDocs site, which is the blog post. So it's just like, this is a thread for comments for this post, and then you just do it there. So when someone visits your blog, you render that static blog post, right? But then the comments are dynamic. So you make a network request for them. So now in your AddonDocs site for Mirage, let's say, you're doing like, you're fetching that JSON endpoint using whatever to fetch those comments. So the thing is, GitHub's API is like free, but it's the open version, unauthenticated version has a limit to the amount of requests you can make. So if you were to just say like, whatever it is, api.github/v3/samselkoff/Ember/Mirage/issues, filter by, label blog post comments, and then match it up. You can only do like so many of those per hour. So that would run out pretty quick.
Yeah, I've seen this happen on when people share Ember twiddles. I've seen this.
Since that's powered by
Gist. And I've seen this happen where it doesn't load, and I always forget like there's some solution to this problem, but you have to do something with your browser. Or, someone said like use a VPN once, but I've never I've always gotten to that point and just given up. Right.
So the way GitHub does this is by IP address. So if you visited my site,
so that
you would get
now
run
the
out.
VPN answer makes sense. Yep.
You would get run out, and then I would get run out. So that's kind of a crappy solution because then like you have random users who just can't load the blogs anymore or whatever, the comments. So then the answer to this is to have a server make the requests. And then you don't pay money, you just need a server somewhere. So that's one of the things that this utterances thing does. On the setup side, the users who are commenting need to allow it access to their account. But on the setup side, like if I'm setting up Mirage's AddonDocs site, I need to like install utterances as a GitHub app into my repo, give it access to my public repositories. And then what it does is basically creates a URL that my hosted Mirage doc site can use to go to proxy into GitHub's API. So since now my AddonDocs site is making API requests to like, whatever it is, Mirage utterances.herokuapp.com or whatever, it's going through that layer which has authed with GitHub. And so it's acting as a reverse proxy.
Yeah, that proxy also, like it appends an actual GitHub API key. So it's not an unauthenticated request, and the rate limit is higher. It's like a lot higher, right?
It's like 5,000 requests per hour or something like that.
Yeah.
It's really high.
Yep.
Or per minute or something like that.
Right.
It's high enough that it doesn't matter.
And also too, you could like, if the blog ever got that popular, since you're always going through one place, you could set up like some sort of cache there.
Yes.
So you only ever ping GitHub, 1 over 5,000 times.
Yes.
Per hour.
Yep.
I just, what I'm trying to say. I said that completely backwards.
No, totally. Basically that's one answer to this problem is to use a server to make the request on your behalf. So that's kind of interesting. And again, the utterances thing, now the artsy blog post that talks about this, they don't go the utterances route because they still want you to they're still kind of explaining how they did it in the simplest way possible. It's like low level and lets you style the comments however you want. But they still, even if you're not doing utterances, you're just doing it yourself, you still are going to run into the rate limiting issue. And so they made a simple like one-click Heroku deploy app thing where you put in like your repo name and then you create a new private key, personal is a SSH key. It's not an SSH key.
I think it's like an API key.
It's an API key, and you just go from like your GitHub settings and you can just create it and you can you paste that in this thing and you create the app. And then again, it's the same situation where you just have a proxy server as a node server set up for you, and it forwards certain requests onto GitHub's API.
Yeah. I wonder if this sort of what we're talking about here gets popular enough that GitHub could say like, look, this is great. It gets more people like kind of locked into our system.
Right.
Maybe, we're not going to force people to set up these proxy apps or like add apps to their GitHub account.
Well, that's what we were talking about because Mirage, Mirage.com is a site hosted on GitHub pages. So GitHub is already serving my site and I'm making an API request to GitHub from my GitHub hosted site. So you would think there'd be some way to say like, the computer's right there. Just you don't need to limit the things. It's right there. You know.
But I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it's still the request is still it's initiated by your site, but it's still coming from my browser.
Yes.
And so GitHub is gonna, I don't know why they rate limit their API, but I'm sure they have reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, just this comment thing could be something. It's
So yeah, the comment thing could totally be. So another part of this discussion was I was talking with Adam, who runs Tailwind, is way more popular than any project I've worked on, and thus suffers from issues of scale much faster and earlier than I ever have, even though I've had those issues as well. And so for him, his issues became polluted very quickly, and to keep them actionable and focused on development, he actually created a second repo, tailwind.org/discuss. And he has a link to the issues sorted by most recently updated. So he basically made it hacked in a forum into GitHub Issues, just so that if people are talking about like, what would Tailwind look like if it did this? It's just kind of open-ended discussions. He doesn't care about closing those issues. It's just a place to discuss things, which has some overlap with a blog with comments, right? Which is under the hood being powered by like GitHub comment issues. So there's a lot of similarities here. And he's even said like, what I would really ideally like is just you have issues and then you have like discussion or forums as another tab in your repository. And it could literally be the same, powered by all the same things as issues, just to have a separation there. We've talked about this before where we would like GitHub to have like bugs and features, and for features to have some voting thing capabilities first class on them. All these tools would help open source maintainers a lot. I get it's not an easy like one decision. There's a million ways to do this, but that's one way that GitHub's interface could help nudge maintainers towards like good practices and making sure they're like doing maintainable work on their projects. So that was really interesting because now you have a thing where you've got basically a GitHub repo hacked to be used for issues, but now we have a way to show GitHub issues on a website. So we also talked about like a discourse forum, and what's the benefit there versus like this hacked GitHub repo thing. There's a lot of nice things about the GitHub repo, which is developers already have an account, they're familiar with it. There's nice things about the discourse forum. There's lots of nice things about it. Email subscriptions. I guess GitHub threads have that too, but it's a tool focused on the forum use case, so it's going to be better at certain things for it, right?
Yes. Yep.
So then we had this conversation where, okay, so let's say we go this route where Mirage blog posts are markdown files and comments are GitHub issues. So first thing I didn't like about this is you see the blog post and you kind of want to just respond to something right there. It's a nice thing about Discuss and being able to comment from the web page is like you can just scroll up and see it right there. I even like how Medium you can like highlight a sentence and do that. I think that's really great.
Yes.
I think it's really awesome. But I like that just as to try and think of the lowest friction way to get someone to give you some feedback, to engage people using your library. I think it's good. So that was one thing I didn't like about this solution. So then I was thinking like, what would it look like to take the blog post and like copy that markdown, because it's markdown, it's portable, and throw it in the top thread of the GitHub thread. So it's like you publish it, you build your app, deploy it, you have a new blog post, and then you put that in the top of the thread, and then you link it up somehow. Then it's kind of like, okay, so now they can click like comment on GitHub maybe, and they go there and they see it, and that's just like they're working in GitHub. But then it's like now you have the blog post in two places, and like the programmer inside of me is like, there needs to be a single source of truth somewhere, right? And you could like do some code to sync that stuff, but whatever. Then I was thinking like, what about putting the blog post in the issue and pulling that as well? So the way you author a blog post is actually just by creating a GitHub issue and tagging it as blog post or something like that.
I mean, the great thing about this is now you don't have to redeploy your AddonDocs site when you want to
change your blog post.
Yeah.
Or edit an old one.
Yep.
Exactly. So now your AddonDocs site is just reading. It's read only. It's just read only. So it just queries GitHub API and it just renders the blocks, the blog post, and all the comment counts and everything. And that's pretty cool too, because there's maybe people who like to stay in GitHub or people who are already subscribed via email. This happens to me where sometimes I'll open a new issue to brainstorm and someone subscribed to the repo, so they see it and they chime in. It's just a nice way for them to follow along,
Yeah.
And now they basically are able to see new blog posts. It's also like, if you think about the lowest friction way to let an add-on author start blogging, now it's like you have some issue and you just add the label blog post to it, and boom, it's going to show up on your fancy AddonDocs website.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the like the whole motivation behind this is you want to get feedback from Mirage users.
Right.
You want low friction ways to do that.
Right.
And also too for you to author.
Right.
So yeah, this is
right, and you already have great editing tools there, so it's pretty cool. So that led us to talk about like some of the implications for the data side and the rendering and the caching stuff. So it's this kind of interesting conversation, right? Because when you have the blog, there's something nice about blog posts in Markdown files because they're generated build time and they're static files. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because you could imagine rendering the blog page and fetching the comments lazily after initial render using an API request. But now you got the blog as well. Everything kind of like above the fold or whatever is dynamic data.
Yeah. So I guess
you've kind of changed the nature of this thing from a static thing to a dynamic thing.
Yes. Yep. And I guess that has effects for not only rendering and flashing content, but also for bots.
For bots.
Yep.
Exactly. So now so one of the things you lose is like OG tags.
I want that SEO.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially for open source. Like open source blogs. I want to Google some error or just some like, hey, how do I do this in Mirage? And there might be a blog post on it.
Right.
I guess a good thing here is just you would lose like the bots like Twitter and Slack, but Googlebot runs JavaScript.
Right.
And it does
EmberMap was crawled very well before we ever added fast boot.
Yeah. Yep.
But that led us to talking about Prember, which is what we have in the back of our minds of adding to AddonDocs at some point, because AddonDocs is like completely static generated. Why not pre-render every page of it? So again, now you have, if the blog posts are just routes and they're markdown files, then you can just go through those and pre-render them. But now what if they're coming from the GitHub API? So how would that work?
I think Prember will boot your app and start requesting pages and then saving that off as an HTML file somewhere.
So if you wanted to say, like, let's just pre-render the site as of 8 a.m., let's do a build.
Yep.
Those model hooks will run. Let's say they make a request to the GitHub API, and you'll end up with a static version of those files.
Right.
there.
You'll get the fast boot content, and you'd write that to an HTML file that matches the route name, the path.
So then the question is, what happens?
Well, there's interesting thing here. We have to go back on what we just said with now if you edit a blog post, it doesn't instantly update. You have to rebuild the app.
Right.
So
you would so you could So if you're going to pre-render the content, then you need to rebuild when you edit the blog post. And now those things aren't really tied to each other anymore, because when it was a file, there's a PR there that you could say, like, on merge, rebuild it. But if you're just editing an issue, it doesn't.
Is there like a hook you can add to Travis? It's like
some activity like edited the issue.
Yeah. I think GitHub does have an events stream.
They do.
That
but I think there's a higher level question here that's like, because what we're talking about actually mirrors a lot of our conversation when we talk about EmberMap stuff. Right now, we're actually just started an EmberMap series where we are adding a feature that shows users which videos they've watched. And it seems like such a small thing. We're just adding a little check mark to this video list, but it fundamentally changes certain things because you're adding user-specific dynamic data to parts of the site that were previously not. So I think it's good to think about this and try to think about, is there a way we can categorize different aspects, different data that a site needs to render, and say, here's where things change less frequently, and here's where things change more. And there's a point where it makes sense to have the dynamic stuff, the stuff that's more dynamic, because also it's not a binary thing, right?
Yeah, yes, yep.
And like, this is another aspect, because you take something from a markdown file and then put it into GitHub and then request it. You've made a binary switch, but like, just like we just said, there's things, even though things are static, they still change and you need to redeploy things. So I think the way to think about it is the data that powers your site is more or less dynamic. And when it gets to a certain level of dynamism, like if it changes frequently enough, it makes sense to put it in like a data store, whether it's behind an API.
It's a runtime concern.
Yeah, right.
It goes from build time to runtime.
Right. It goes from build time to runtime. And what are the implications of that? It means putting it in a data store. So either like in an API, like a service, like GitHub or Discuss, or like your backend, like a database. And when it's less dynamic, when it's more static, you can put it in the source code of the repository and do it at build time. And then when thinking about caching, like you can cache everything that's static. And then when it comes to dynamic things, you can either cache them and bust the cache, or you can let it render lazily and just cache like the shell. So you could imagine just caching and pre-rendering with Prember the shell of the blog, but not the content itself.
Right.
But that has other implications for like the SEO stuff.
Right. There's trade-offs there.
There's trade-offs there. So what's the answer, Master Yoda?
Yeah, I think you just have to look at like, what does the end user want, and kind of prioritize all those features. Like, is flashing content okay for the end user versus like, where does SEO stand for the end user, and ranking them, and probably there's maybe like one or two things that are really, really important.
Right.
And that drives your architecture.
Right.
You can kind of bend these like trade-off curves with like services like Fastly that will act as a cache that has like a secondary index that can instantly invalidate. So we do something similar to this on EmberMap, where on
I
EmberMap,
have bronchitis. I just want everyone to feel bad for me for like the next month.
I feel bad for you.
I'll feel bad for you when you catch everything.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, everything is static, and then when something dynamic changes, we bust all those static pages. So there's kind of like ways you can bend those,
Right.
But yeah,
Our backend people just laughing at us. No, but the beautiful thing about this is that the whole AddonDocs site is a static site. It doesn't need a server. That's why this is so cool. That's why you don't have to pay for anything or press a button to set up, manage a Heroku app. If you can get it working with static plus services, you just get to throw it up on GitHub pages, and you don't have to think about anything.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. There's something super nice about that constraint.
Yes.
And like we've seen the rise of static sites, right?
Yes. And especially if like there's more services that are like headless content services, where you can just have them manage your data in a certain structured format, but you can pull it in and do the rendering.
Right.
Maybe bots like Googlebot can run JavaScript. Does a pretty good job at running it.
So maybe the SEO stuff is actually not as big of a concern.
Yeah, maybe that goes away. That
So what are the trade-offs here? So the downside is not the pre-rendered stuff, and you lose some of the SEO stuff, and like rich unfurling of URLs if you were to render OG tags. If you make it all static, if you make it all dynamic, but the benefit is just it changes. The more likely it is to change, the better. The stronger the argument is to make it purely dynamic, come from GitHub's API.
And not to like ruin this parade, but sites like WordPress do bend this in a way that they're dynamic, but they do generate how we're talking about static today. They do generate HTML,
right? But then you need a server.
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Yes.
So once you have a server, you can do lots of things. But the fun thing is to think about how far can you get without a server.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
So I think it's interesting to think about those constraints.
That is true, because like, I have a few add-ons on AddonDocs, and it's so easy.
Yeah.
And I don't have to set up anything. I don't have to manage anything.
Yeah.
And so for every add-on that I make, I will have an AddonDocs site. But like, how many would I set up a blog, even if it was a Medium blog or like a WordPress blog? Probably not that many, because that's like stuff I have to maintain and deal with. So I really like the no server constraint.
Right. There's other trade-offs or other solutions we've talked about, which is you could put, and we actually do this right now for the version selector in AddonDocs. So there's an in-between where you have dynamic data, the equivalent of the dynamic data separate from the build. And but it's not coming from a service. And it's actually just a data file in your GitHub Pages branch. So you could imagine the markdown files as being just files on the server in a directory and the Ember app requests those things and then like turns them in HTML on the client. And so what would you be able to do there? I guess it would just be, you would avoid the rate limiting stuff. So you wouldn't even need any of that stuff. And then the question is like comments, you would still do that in like GitHub or something like that.
Yeah. You'd lose the bots. You'd lose the bots in that.
Right. So you could also put those data files into the master branch. And if you change those, but that's the same thing as putting them in as markdown files in the source code. So I'm trying to think, if we had headless version of Discuss, would we be having this conversation right now?
No, I don't think so. Because
the only benefit to this still, the only downside is that everyone still has to set up their own Discuss for each project. Whereas if you can come up with a solution that uses GitHub and just requires like a single button click rate limiting node instance or something on Heroku, then that seems like a more scalable, like reproducible solution.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for me, I would appreciate that because all of my open source is already on GitHub.
Right.
So right. Yes, if you can just use that, I guess the other, there's always a trade-off, right? The other side is like someone might say like, well, I use Bitbucket or GitLab.
Yes.
And now you're forcing me to use GitHub. Right. And I don't, That's
a good point.
So Discuss gets around that.
It gets around that. And it's also like, you could also package up the markdown files as blog posts really nicely in AddonDocs. And then the comments is just like an extra thing that we can show you how to do, but it's not actually like a needed thing. Yep. So there's still a super low friction way for people to start blogging. And all of the infrastructure is there. We were even talking about like a higher level thing in AddonDocs where you just have like AddonDocs/blog/ and then you have like a slug, like 2019-02-04- my post, and then you just start going and it's going to show up in a blog or whatever. It's going to be pre-rendered. It's going to be SEO. So, it's tough. That's there's something so nice about having markdown files in the app.
Well, another thing about that is that you can, in a blog post, you can link to like edit this blog post.
Yes.
And then someone can open a PR with, for me, it would have a bunch of spelling mistake corrections. But that would be, that would help me out so much. But yeah, so that's.
But then there's also something cool about opening an issue. Like I want to blog something down real quick. It's a thought, man. Like I've been seeing Chan can code will write these crazy issues threads.
Yeah,
and like he'll just tweet about it because it's something super interesting. And I click on it and like. It just, when you're looking at it in the context of GitHub, there's so much visual noise because GitHub is for coding and stuff. It'd be something really appeals to me about being able to grab that and just, he could send a link to his project page and it's just a beautifully rendered site.
Yes.
Makes it more readable.
So that's another side on the trade-off thing is like, what happens if you've been working on this PR for a while and you're like, a lot of people like they spend a lot of time on the PRs, like describing why they're doing it, what changes. It's pretty cool that you could just instantly turn that into a blog post by applying a blog post label.
Yes.
That's really, really cool. Yes. So yeah.
And we've talked about, using comments in the top of the GitHub issue and just having like a published at so you can just control how it shows up. Something really cool about it. I think where I'm at right now, I want to try it out. I think it's the better of the two once you evaluate all trade-offs. I think it's better people have a slightly easier way to publish blog posts and for people to interact with them via GitHub threads than to have pre-rendered links for the majority of what people want. There's also something nice about it that because AddonDocs sites are versioned, if you have the markdown files in the root and then you publish a new version and like your old build has like those old blog posts, that's no good. Like you don't want
you'd have
10
to do
copies of a blog post on the internet with like at /version/14x.
Yeah, you'd have to do something like your latest thing where like there's just one blog URL. Yeah. So
what we were talking about there is if we were to keep them build time files is there's going to be like a new folder called like AddonDocs data where you can put like shared data. And that's basically like versions.json already falls in this category because there's only one versions.json and every version selector in every version of your app queries like the root folder of like your public site. So that would be the answer. Like you could still have the authoring be exactly the same /AddonDocs data /blog/ and then you have like your markdown posts, which is cool. And then you make your blog route, fetch that, and render those things.
Yeah.
So you could do it.
By the way, everything you just said is why I use AddonDocs, because I don't ever want to think about shared data between the different patch releases of my add-ons.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yes. Thank Dan too, because Dan did a lot of the deploy stuff, and Chris obviously has done a ton of stuff too. So it's super powerful tool. It's fun to work on too. But I think I'm going to go forward with this with just Mirage and then use it for a bit, see if I like it, and if so, we should be able to wrap up some of the UI work into AddonDocs. And then the only step for like add-on authors would be basically your app you'd put in a config variable, which would basically be the domain that you're making requests to. And it would be this new like node app that you set up to act as a reverse proxy. And there is a possible world where we set up a single like AddonDocs proxy server that can handle like all the AddonDocs sites.
Folks can go in there, add their own private keys. It's basically like a big centralized reverse proxy in a GitHub with a bunch of different private keys.
Yeah, but there's something
API
nice
keys.
about the isolation, right? Because there's a security implication of like a centralized. If you just had one server that could.
I don't know. I don't know if I buy that, because like when you launch that one server, you're clicking a link that's like launch us on Heroku, and you're just like, okay.
Yeah. I was thinking like, I guess it's the server code that is responsible for the security. It just seems like it's just centralized. So like if you had like 100 AddonDocs sites that were all using a single reverse proxy server to hit GitHub's API. Yeah, I don't know. Seems like something could go wrong there more easily than if they each had their own.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just at a high level. I don't know.
Right. That's why you got to distribute it. You have half of it running on AWS, half of it running on Google Cloud.
Exactly.
Get
just
a
make things simpler
out there that's downloading GitHub issues. Come on, man.
Do you want to rant about distributed systems?
I don't really hate.
I just sniped you.
No, I
you were ranting about them this morning.
What was I ranting about?
About how complex modern architecture is.
Yeah. Front end app, back end app.
There it is.
No, I'm not. I still believe.
He's turning red, folks.
I still believe.
He's really holding back.
I still believe in JavaScript. I haven't.
Are you crossing your fingers behind your back right now?
You go pull EmberMap's GitHub repo. You're like, index.php. What
the? Yeah, exactly. It's just like there's like a underscore router in the root, and it just like forwards all requests. Like, oh yeah, that's our Ember app. This is what's powering EmberMap.com. It's like we just replace all EmberMap with 20 lines of PHP. That's amazing.
No, it is. I won't really rant about this, but it is interesting that it's like grass is always greener. I remember when I work on server rendered apps, it's always like, man, I want like first class testing and a first class like file layout and conventions for all my JavaScript code. And then when I work on JavaScript apps, I'm like, I want first class validations and I want first class models and
model
data
graphs.
and data communication between. And so it's always, I do think there's a world where those two things will come together.
People are just doing too many different things right now.
Yeah. Which we've talked about.
We've talked about
before. Yep.
Yeah. I had those 2 interviews with Adam on Full Stack Radio, and one of the things we talked about was, the way we do things in Ember, and we've kind of been in our own world for a long time. I would love to talk to Vue and React folks and see. I think one of the easiest ways to answer this question is like if you were building a blog, let's say, and the index has a list of 10 posts, 20 posts, and then you click on one and it renders the whole thing as a /post. Like, build that, and I just want to see you do that. It's going to tell you a lot. If you were to watch an Ember developer do that, they would use models. First of all, they would have an ORM, right?
Yep.
So they would have blog posts. I'm painting broad strokes. I know people don't use Ember data or models or whatever, but in the general sense, there would be an ORM and it would be a post model. Post has many comments. You'd make a find all to post, get those 20 posts, render them, and then you would link to the detail route, and you could either pass in the post or the post by ID, because your detail route should say store find record post with the ID that's in the URL. And it should just cache it. You should click on that from the index to the detail page, and it should be an instant sync render with potentially a background reload. But that's like the happy path in Ember.
Right. And going with your theme of broad strokes, it would just, you would link to the post model, and it's already been loaded, and it displays the post model. Now, where that logic figures that out, we're just going to skip over that for now. But
exactly.
Yeah, you have an identity map.
Yeah.
You load data into that,
yes.
and then the UI displays it.
Yep, and it's a sync render. And if you are on that detail page and you share that link with someone, it's going to work as well. Even, you know what I'm saying? Because you have find record in there. So you have the initial render work, and you have subsequent renders work, and it's built into the model hook and the store's Ember data's cache.
Yep.
So that would be what I would want to find out. If you were just starting a new React React app today, and you're a React developer, what would you do? And would what you do like lead to the same behavior or different behavior for a variety of reasons? Would you fetch data on the transition from the index to the detail? Would you reload certain data? Like, what does that all involve?
Yep.
So, and same with views. So I'd be really interested to see that. So if there's any listeners out there who know what that looks like, or has a simple example, or someone I could talk to, I'd really appreciate that, because this is related to some of the Mirage stuff we've been talking about, because how we think about mocking the network layer and flexing all the states of our application is related to how we think about data loading in Ember apps. So, so that was interesting. And what else do you want to talk about? We've got angle brackets, backwards compatibility, plus a Celery test. Oh, that was an interesting thing. You know, one thing from last week's episode was it's basically hard to tell kind of what versions of dependencies your project works with. And I think in one of these threads I was reading, Edward was just like, really the only way you know is to test. It's kind of a good answer. I mean, it's like there's more to it than it sounds like, right? But if it's like, if you run into a situation where your add-on depends on Lodash 1 and you depend on something that depends on Lodash 0.5, you really are in a situation that cannot be resolved, and that's where the resolutions comes in. Now, this actually happens a lot for exactly the reasons we talked about last week, because of the cultural issues, because of the way dependencies are specified. So it happens a lot just in the course of normal development. And you don't want to stop the world for every developer when they hit that situation, right? Because it would just be like, that's a non-solution. So that's why things kind of move forward anyways. And again, right now, like, things are just kind of mashed together. But at the end of the day, if things are mashed together, but your test pass, is it a problem? And like, really the only way to say whether or not your thing works with these different versions of a dependency is to see, like, if you have good test coverage and they pass, right?
Yeah. I mean, I love that, because how do you know it works? You go and you try to use it. And if you can deploy it to production, then it works.
Yes.
So how do we automate that and get as close to that as possible into testing?
Yes.
So that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Really good answer.
So we were talking about this with like, we had that issue last week where someone was on like Ember 2.4 and they tried to reinstall their app fresh install, and something broke because Mirage depended on something that had moved past like the end of life Ember version. And you were like, is the answer here to just say like, sorry, you're working on an unsupported version of Ember? Like, that's why things aren't working. Like, I don't know specifically why, but that's enough to say we don't support that anymore.
Yeah, and that feels like a really weird answer. A lot of times when I'm like looking at add-ons, I'll look at their try config, and a lot like simple auth and a lot of the simple lab stuff, it goes back to like 1.13.
Yeah, right.
It's like, wow, that's amazing. And same with our stuff. Like, I have like 2.4, 2.8, 2.12 in there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I don't want to remove this. It's almost like the Ember community is really big on stability without stagnation, right? That's like one of the main talking points of Ember.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
when you have an add-on that works all the way back to 113, it's like, listen, I've bought into the stability without stagnation thing.
Totally.
And I'm, it's cool. It's powerful. It's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just found it interesting because it came up last week and you said that you were like, do we just say it's unsupported? But that kind of feels like a non-answer. And we had this kind of note down in our podcast topics list to talk about, because you had a hit in this like a month ago when you were working on either storefront or fast boot testing or something. You were like, I just realized that I'm testing my add-on back to 113 and I didn't even think about it. It's not something, this is not a value that you had to opt into. And we were talking about this in the context of like good design and polish versus stability without stagnation, right? And what the Celery Test is. So what was all that about?
You want me to explain? You want me?
Well, I want you to talk about your experience. I mean, you basically said it, but it was, what was the add-on you were working on? And you were saying like...
It might have been storefront, or I actually don't remember. I think it might have been storefront. I think it goes back to like 2.4 or 2.0. But yes.
I like the way you said it. You were talking about how this is not something that people are having to goad me into doing.
Right. No one pointed at me and said, you have to get this add-on working on 2.0. If you look at all the other open source I've worked on in like Ruby and other programming languages, I don't really make it work with Ruby 1.9.1 and 1.8.7. Like those things are end of life. I've just moved on from those.
Right.
But in Ember, like I do.
Right.
And so there's a question like, why? Why is that? And it's a stability without stagnation thing when the leaders of Ember, especially like Tom and Yehuda, but like also just people that work on other add-ons kind of have this mentality. It's like, you want to like
fall in line.
Yeah. It's like, you want to like, it's almost like embarrassing. Like, okay, sure. 2.12 is end of life. I don't need to support that. But it's almost like, wait, am I like doing a good job as an Ember developer if I'm not like going with the community? And I think the really interesting thing here is again, no one is forcing this on us. No one's opening issues saying like, hey, get in line. Yeah. You got to work back to 113. But so why is it? Where does this come from?
Yeah. I think that's really good insight. And when we first had this conversation, you basically were saying, this is an example of really good leadership.
Yes.
And this is like, again, it's not people complaining, which happens in every community, but we've been there when it happens in the Ember community, and we complain about things on this podcast. We complain about things.
It's the whole reason we started the podcast.
Yeah. So we had an outlet for complaining. And if we complain about something like a polish of a project or documentation, and it feels like, why isn't this a value? Why isn't this upheld consistently across the community? And then you come across the issue about stability without stagnation. And you see that the leadership is, it's the Celery Test. So the Celery Test comes from Start With Why, which is the Simon Sinek book I think we've talked about before. But he basically says, one way that leaders build trust and actually lead their followers, or lose trust and lose their followers, is if their actions line up with their words. And the Celery Test is this idea that you have like a health person who's on the TV talking about healthy living, and then you see this person at I'm trying to think of the name of the guy with like the tights in the 70s, and he like does all the dancing and stuff.
Oh, it's like Richard
Richard, wait, not Richard Simmons, is it? It might be. I can't remember.
He's got like the big afro.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you see Richard, it is Richard Simmons, isn't it?
Is it? I think that guy has like a really like sad story. Like I think he became like a shut-in.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awful.
Katie was telling me something about that.
It is Richard Simmons. He's an American fitness instructor, actor, and video producer. That's him right there.
Nice.
I wonder if I can do this. So I just showed a blurry picture of Richard Simmons with a camera. So you see Richard Simmons in his prime, right, at the grocery store, and you see him checking out. He's right in front of you, and he's got a basket full of candy bars, and bacon and all this unhealthy stuff. Well, okay, bacon might be healthy. We don't know that yet, but candy bars are not. And you're like, man, what's going on? Like, what happens in that situation? You just don't buy anything this guy says anymore. You're just like, it doesn't make sense. Like, I'm not going to trust him. Whereas you see him checking out with Celery, that's where the internal why lines up with the external what. And like in the book, it does a really nice framing where you have the why is internal then you have the how as the outside concentric ring, and then the very outside is the what. So yeah, you want to pass the Celery Test. You want the things that you say and preach in a conference keynote to line up with people's experience of what you're actually doing when you're putting code out there, when you're writing documentation sites and all this stuff.
Can I haven't finished it. I haven't finished this book.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question here? Is it almost like the Celery Test is not only just like you want it to line up, but the Celery Test is actually your values, no matter what you say.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way to think about it. I think, yes, I think Sinek might say that it's possible to have unexamined values, and for you to be acting in a way that is kind of unexamined.
Okay.
And so I guess that's an open question, but I can
see that you're like feeling something out. You're throwing some things out there. They're not. You don't need to like go buy into them. You don't need to change your life, but right. And like, well, I can think about this with us, where in the last 2 years, where we've come to the things we've come to believe about marketing, let's say, whereas we didn't place as much emphasis on that in the beginning, but now we wouldn't want to put a project out there if it didn't complete that triangle. And so, have our values changed, or have we had a better understanding of our values, and we realized where the areas where the what didn't line up with our why? So, I don't know. It's a good question. I would say a little both. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because you learn some things, but you also you learn what it's like to be successful, but then you also learn like, okay, I was wrong in these areas.
Right. So it's definitely worth, that's the thing I love about that book, is that it calls these things out explicitly and makes you be very deliberate and say, okay, what is our why, both internally, and what is the why that we're projecting, right? And he talks about like Apple, the why is about being a rebel and like going against the status quo and thinking different. And so you have that as like, you could ask like, what is internal to Steve Jobs or other people at the top of Apple, and then what is projected, that why messaging, and then how does that not line up with their products and stuff like that. So Richard Simmons has the external why, and does it line up with the Celery? If it's not, it's a violation of the Celery Test. Ember has lots of values we could talk about, and one of them is stability without stagnation. And I think when you come into the Ember ecosystem, this is a case where the Celery Test is passed with flying colors, because, like you said, you've got add-on support back 4 or 5 years. You've got a community that is, they show the graphs of like the adoption of the newest versions of Ember at EmberConf every year, and like 80 or 90% of people are like on the latest 2 or 3 major versions or something like that. You've got this idea of long-term stability built in.
You create a new Ember add-on and you get a try config.
Yes.
That goes back to what I think goes back to like 2.16 now, or 2.12.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
also too, like, not just to keep adding to this, there's other areas in Ember where this is also true. Like, back in the 1.0 days, it was all about not breaking the URL.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then you saw this. It wasn't use Ember because it has the best router. It was don't break the URL.
Yeah.
And how do you, like, the Celery Test was like, look at this amazing
look at every
router.
Ember app, they don't break the URL. And and these people tweeting about, how do I know if an app is built with JavaScript? I try to command click or reload and it breaks. But that didn't happen with Ember apps.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And it still doesn't today.
Yeah.
So that's a great example.
And I love that when you're talking about that, you're not listing the features of the router.
Mm-hmm.
You're not saying things like, oh, well, we have before model and it can return promises and block rendering.
Mm-hmm.
You're not getting into like some feature comparison checklist. There's like a value there, and it's don't break the URL. And you hear that value and you're like, yes,
yep,
I want to follow. I want in.
Yes, totally. That's really good. I think that gets to some of the best examples of leadership we've seen in the community, and it's why the community is still around today, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So that's really cool. It also, when we had this conversation, we were talking about like values in different communities and what those are and what they value. One thing I heard that made a big impact that I just remember was Justin Jackson talking about giving a talk at Laracon, and he was talking about polish being one of these things that's like a clear value in Laravel communities. And you see it in the way both they talk about it I think Taylor has this like Stack Overflow question where he's asking about the value of like spending hours on like code comments and formatting his code to make it easy to read and stuff like that. So it's like that's that kind of like I kind of have that mental image of like what does the inside of the computer look like? Is it clean? That's like there's a value he brings to the community, and you can see it's upheld by like every project in the ecosystem. And so Justin was saying like, yeah, I want to give a talk, but I'm almost nervous because the bar is so high to even be there. You wouldn't want to, it's kind of what you said, you wouldn't want to be like, am I being a good Ember developer? It's like, am I being a good Laravel community member if I don't bring polish to it, right?
And it's not, it's so interesting because it's not like shame. It's not like the community is going to point out that like you're not polished enough or you're not backwards compatible enough. But it's just like the ecosystem kind of just sets that bar and it sets it so high. I love that.
Right. And that's, and then thinking about like, everyone who's an Ember developer has their own angle on this, and they have their own values that matter more to them or less to them, right? Accessibility or visual design or powerful APIs or convention over configuration and stability without stagnation, whatever it is. And so there's ways that you can make it. So for example, with AddonDocs, one of my goals, that's one of the goals of the project, right? Is once you start seeing a bunch of AddonDocs sites and they look great, they work on mobile, they have versions, there's not going to be room for anyone without that. And there shouldn't be. It should be easy enough that it's just something you get for free, right? And then it's thinking about like convention over configuration is also very important to us. And there's some areas where the Celery Test is definitely passed, and then there's some areas where it's not, where there could be a lot more conventions shared across the community, whether it's like the data fetching stuff that we always talk about. And I just think it's interesting to think. I think this is like the right way to think about the leadership question or documentation, right? I think that's something that's like, if we hear people saying that documentation is really important, then we should see great docs. And a lot of times those are the things that are done at the end or not done at all. So that's another question. Like, how can we make it, the way to fix that is not to get on a podcast and complain about it. Well, maybe that's one thing that we can do and we will always do. But like, if you think about wanting to be, whether it's like your bigger community or the sub community that you're making around your project or something, the leadership by example and through tooling that empowers people is going to be, if I start submitting features and closing them in Mirage without documenting them, which I've done in the past, I'm setting a precedent and it's going to happen again. Whereas if I never accept a PR without corresponding docs in the AddonDocs site, it's just not going to happen, right?
Yep.
So you set that precedent. And it's like you said, you want to be like, am I being a bad developer in this area? Because like, look at the leadership, look at the example that leadership has set.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think it's interesting to reflect on what are the ways that everyone in a community, both people at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom, can be leaders and help move the community towards the future vision that they have in their mind.
Yeah, I guess a really good thing, like something that maybe we could try to do is like, before we do something, just ask ourselves, like, what are our values? And just remind ourselves, like, yeah, does this fit?
Right.
A lot of times you just want to get something fixed.
Right.
But yeah, maybe you just ask yourself, like, yeah, does this align with my bigger long-term values? And and if the answer is yes, don't feel bad about going the slow route.
Totally. That's also I read this other great book recently. It's called The Power of a Positive No. And one of the lessons I loved from that was that when you say no to something, there's a deeper yes underneath that. So if someone's asking you for a feature request and you can't support it to the level where you want based on your other values, like stability without stagnation or like a value of making sure people can understand how to use it, then you're going to say no to that thing. But it's because you're saying yes to maintaining a level of quality or polish of the project. So getting to a point where you're okay with that and you know that your job is not to, you're going to be disappointing people. Your job is not to make them happy. If you want to stay true to your values, that there's some tension there sometimes. And that's why it's good to examine this stuff and be true to it. So I think there's times where, like you said, like you're working on a problem and you know that this abstraction could just help. So you add it to the library and you get on with your day. But then there's just this hidden abstraction. It's this great thing that's hidden in your code base and no one else ever is going to know about it because no one's going to find it. And it didn't make it in the docs, and you have a conversation like, oh yeah, that could do that. Like just do that thing. Like it's been in there forever, but that's not, you've missed the accessibility mark there because it's not accessible to anybody. Like no one can see it. So if accessibility in the broad sense, like making things accessible to beginners and learners is a value, then you need to think about that and make sure you pass the Celery test. And if you don't, then it's going to fall by the wayside here. So
nice. Have you ever had anything like with Mirage where you're just sort of chugging along and then you're like, oh, hold up, like this, like you realize after the fact, you're like,
yeah, it just happened today. Someone asked if there's a way to like look up a relationship and get the model name from a named relationship. And there is a way. I use it internally, and it's like schema dot model class for user association for blog post. And let's say that's a type post, so you can get that. All that stuff's in there. Now I hid it from the docs because it's not really public API, but it is in a sense that it's not. Yeah, I don't know. It's in this kind of weird territory. Yeah. But there's other things like that. Methods on collections that are absolutely public and that aren't in the docs or that aren't explained. So I have that as a to-do. Like I'm purposefully closing all the bugs. And there's only like one thing left now that I figured out all this dependency stuff. But part of like a bug for me right now is like the fact that there's a lot of the docs that are messed up in Mirage right now. So that's going to be, I'm trying to hold myself to that standard and say, this is a trade-off I'm making. I'm not going to do the new feature stuff until I wrap this stuff up to the quality I want it. And going forward, it's going to be the same thing. So it's happened all the time. But I think like making it more visible and the practices we've talked about of like labeling things as bugs, prioritizing those over feature requests, and cutting down scope. There was a great Basecamp term for that I saw. Judo, they use this like term. They have like a few terms that they use from their playbook. And one is like, how can we judo that to like cut scope? And then there's another one that was like, it was like scope drilling or something like that. But basically like, I wasn't thinking like this 2 years ago or 3 years ago, even with the new series that we're doing. How do we show users the videos that they've watched, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, there's a lot of ways you could do that. And we'll talk about this in the coming weeks because like it's some interesting questions around there. But you could show people on like a page so it's like my watched videos. You could have a filter on like a videos page. What we're doing is like the judo version, which is just add a checkbox next to the existing UI elements, and that'll be the first step.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because that probably comes from, we feel like there's too many pages on the site and they're all maintenance burden.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that's true. That feature is driven from we want everything on the website to look good.
Right. We want to think about all the states before so we don't get to like unanticipated states.
Right. And adding a new page.
Yeah. And we just didn't build the app like that when we started it.
Right. Yep.
We didn't.
Yep.
So I think that's like one of the main answers is just, there's something really powerful about listing out and thinking about your values and making sure the work you do is aligned with them. And I think that Celery test is really powerful because you don't want to be caught holding a Snickers bar at the checkout line.
I mean, I do. I like Snickers.
Well, what happens when you go back to Colorado and your buddies want to go for a 13-mile run like they did 2 years ago? Weren't you just in Colorado, but you were drinking beer outside? Isn't that what you told me?
Yeah. It was interesting, though, because we went for a hike one day, and it was like everyone. It's just out there hiking. And it's just like, wow.
They're all holding celery, aren't they?
Yeah. It's just not something you see in New York.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
Yep. It's pretty clear what the people's values are. It's right there. Yeah. Right in your face. So cool. I think that's wraps it for today. Yeah?
Yep.
Let's wrap it.
Cool. Where can you find more episodes?
Find more episodes on EmberMap.com/podcast. We have a cool podcast page now. It's one of my favorites on the site.
Does it pass your Celery test?
I think it does pass the Celery test, actually. Yeah. It's fast. Looks pretty good. Looks good on mobile. Yep. I like it.
Nice.
So put down that Snickers bar, pick up that celery, go to EmberMap.com/podcast, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.